That's my girl. That's my girl. That's my girl.
What's up, my Wizards dev? SBMTG. Now, we got decks and stuff on YouTube. Today, though, we have spoilers, finally. Today marks the faux shiz start of spoiler season. They're going to start coming down the pipeline a lot faster now. And today we got some really exciting stuff. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So got a lot to talk about. As usual, I'm going to do these in the order of importance, but I'm going to flip it. I'm going to talk about the most important stuff first today because I want to get that out of the way. The most talked about card of the day by far, Nahiri, the Harbinger. She's a forecasting cost planeswalker that's 2 generic, a red and a white, and she starts with 4 loyalty. You can -2 her, and it says you may discard a card. That's worth noting, the may ability there. You may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. You can -2 her, and it says exile target enchantment, tapped artifact, or tapped creature. We'll get to that in a second. I think that's a very important ability, actually. And then her ultimate is -8. You search your library for an artifact or a creature card, you put it onto the battlefield, and you shuffle your library. That card gains haste, and then you return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Now let's talk about this. Let's put it through the Planeswalker test. There's 3 questions you want to ask yourself when evaluating Planeswalkers. First of all, does this do something good the turn it comes into play? That's usually phrased as, does it generate immediate advantage? Well, sort of. A lot of the answers to these questions will be sort of. Tentatively, yes. Something like that. First of all, her +2 ability, looting is good. Even reverse looting like this, you know, Jace has proven that looting is good. This format has madness. Hello, Ziggy. That was out of nowhere. This format has madness in it, although I'm not sure how many red-white base decks you're going to be building with madness. Although Mardu Madness, a possibility. Her -2, on the other hand, pretty good the turn she comes out. And it's worth noting you can do this twice with her starting loyalty without having to put any more loyalty counters on her. That's pretty good too. But exiling a tapped creature or artifact, you know, or an enchantment even, you know, Silk Wraps in the format, some other things. Pretty darn good if you ask me, and that's pretty good immediate advantage. Taking out an aggro creature that just swung last turn, not bad at all. Taking out, usually you can do this on the play, I would imagine, pretty reliably. Taking out a tapped Jace is probably pretty easy with this card too. So yeah, those first 2 abilities are pretty good as far as what does she do the turn she hits play. The second question you have to ask yourself when looking at Planeswalkers is, does this protect itself? Again, sort of, kind of, you know, that -2, you just talked about this, but it can take out a creature that just swung last turn, you know, sort of as a surprise, hey, exile that guy. That's good, you won't have to worry about that guy swinging in next turn, but there's something kind of weird going on where, like, you sort of, you're forcing them to swing at her, because if they swing at you and don't kill her, you're going to take out whatever, you know, something that they swing with next turn. So there's a weird thing going on there where they like really have incentive to swing at this. So that's not really, in a roundabout way, not protecting herself very well. Usually, does she protect herself is code for does this generate creatures with one of its first 2 abilities. This doesn't do that, and so that really kind of worries me. But the ability to exile creatures is protection. The last question you want to ask yourself is, does this card have the ability to win the game all by itself? Again, sort of. That's another thing that's sort of code for does this generate creatures. This doesn't just generate creature tokens or anything, but its ultimate can go get whatever effing creature you want to go get, which is pretty good, and people are already brewing that in a lot of different ways. You know, one thing that people are doing is that they're just trying to go get the best creature they can think of for the format. You know, in Modern, people are talking about going and getting Emrakul, so that's the thing. And Commander players, by the way, remember that for whatever reason, Emrakul's banned in Commander. Probably a smart decision. So you can't use her to go get Emrakul, which a lot of people are talking about. Can't do it. But in Standard, people are talking about Ulamog, but do remember that with Ulamog, you can't, you don't get to exile 2 things when you put it into play with this. You're not casting it. So there's that, but still, 10/10 haste that mills 20 off the top of their library when it swings. Sounds pretty good. It does pop the creature back to your hand, though. And that's the thing that kind of catches my eye as far as her ultimate goes. Because this, I think of things like Goblin Dark Dwellers is a good example. Good enter the battlefield abilities go really well with this because the card pops back to your hand. And you get a free haste swing with it, you know, that's not bad. But classic faux pas. You shouldn't really evaluate a Planeswalker too much by its ultimate, but, you know, it's worth noting. You can ultimate this on like turn 6, and if you're in a sort of ramp strategy, you can ultimate this on turn 5. So You could if you wanted to, you know, but again, probably try not to focus too much on a Planeswalker's ultimate, and don't focus on all the things I've had to say about her ultimate, because, you know, one of the reasons that we don't look too much at a Walker's ultimate is because a Planeswalker's first 2 abilities are going to be used multiple times a game that Planeswalker is on the board. An ultimate's only going to be used once every few games that the Planeswalker's on the board, so it's not as much of a consideration. Last thing I want to talk about as far as she goes is what are her sort of applications, you know, as far as constructed play. Well, I'm not really sure about the modern playability, but of course modern's not necessarily like my format, you know. Standard playability though, I think this is kind of off the charts and just makes me think of a bunch of different decks all at once, you know. Like I've already mentioned sort of a ramp deck. You can build Naya ramp. That'd be good, you know, one of the Ulamog ramp decks, although I'm not sure that those decks want to cut a 4-drop, you know, they'd have to cut like Hedron Archive, or they'd have to cut Explosive Vegetation, and I don't know if they want to do that, but this card would give you a way of playing Ulamog on turn 5 with reliable ramp on turn 2 or 3, and it, you know, gives the deck some removal. It wants that. The deck kind of wants card draw. It doesn't matter, you know, if you have to discard a card, the deck has cards to filter. So, you know, it could make good use of this piece. Or just like a Boros Walker's deck, I think would be good. I mean, imagine you got Gideon, you got the 6-mana Chandra, which is really coming into her own lately. A lot of people want to play that card. I told you so, by the way. You can even add a 3rd color to that deck in multiple ways. You know, Jeskai gives you counter spells, gives you Jace. You build Mardu, it gives you removal. That's pretty cool. Just extra removal, you know. And if you put green in it, that gives you like Den Protector and Nissa. So, I mean, red-white splash of color walkers could actually be fairly viable, mostly because of this card. So what do we think of her overall? Well, you know, she does slot into a lot of standard ideas. I just went over all that, but after all the hype, I can't help but feeling slightly underwhelmed at the end of the day, despite all the things I've had to say about her. And I know a lot of people agree with me on that, just sort of not so sure and a little bit on the fence about how good Nahiri really is going to be. I will say this though, I really like playing Obnixilis Reignited. That card is really good every time it hits the field for me. And this is sort of comparable, you know, just like Obnix, this draws cards, it can blow creatures away, and in this case, her ultimate's probably better than Obnixilis, and she costs a mana less. So, you know, I like Obnixilis. This probably is really good, and have to at least point this out one more time. We do have Madness in the format, so this looks at least a little bit more attractive. Overall, solid Planeswalker with some pretty decent utility, but leaves a little bit to be desired, and I'd probably give her a B. Second thing I want to talk about, also probably pretty impactful in Standard. This is Anguished Unmaking. What does that do? It's 3 mana, that's a generic, a white, and a black. It's instant speed. Exile target non-land permanent. You lose 3 life. Simple and easy. And a lot of people are griping about that 3 life, but honestly, how many times did I wish that, hey Ziggy, how many times did I wish that Utter End cost 1 less mana? You know, every single time I played it is the answer to that question. This is a great replacement for Utter End. Going to be good for the Eldrazi decks that want to process stuff. That's a consideration. Good for any black-white based or, you know, and maybe Esper Control. So definitely spot on, fantastic card. And remember too, people that are griping about the 3 life, you know, in these colors you have aire, so that's a thing, that's a way to gain life, and there are multiple ways of gaining life in the format. Imagine something like this in the black-white allies deck. That deck gains a ton of life, and this would be a pretty sweet piece of removal for it at instant speed too. So yeah, we're gonna totally play this card, and it's gonna be not a 4 of in like anything, but it's probably gonna be, you know, a 1 or 2 of, just like Utter End was. So really excited to play with this. This card, I'm actually really super duper stoked on, and it's very new, so let me show it to you. This is Vampire Glutton. Here's the translation right here. This is a 1 red mana, 2 power creature, so it really doesn't have to do too much of anything else for people to completely say, just immediately, that red aggro is saved in this format. It really doesn't have to have any text at all, but the text here is that each vampire creature card you own that isn't on the battlefield has madness. Its madness cost is equal to its mana cost. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. It's just unbelievable. It's a vampire itself too, so it has synergy with multiple copies, you know. And with this and Zergo in the format, it's just red aggro is still around. I'm sort of freaking out right now about this card. Still pretty new to me. And just the other day, you know, I'm building red-black aggro, madness aggro for the channel. And one of the big problems, it's just a huge hole in the deck, was the lack of quality 1-drops, especially for this strategy. And now that's not a problem. This is definitely exactly the card that we wanted for that deck. I mean, it really goes a long way towards solving the problem of like, what all in this format is even going to have madness? Like, we've seen Fiery Temper and a couple of other things. Now it's like, okay, this guy's in the field, all your guys have madness. And you're not going to play nothing but vampires in sort of the competitive version of that deck. You'll probably still play Zurgo and a couple of other creatures, and maybe Abbot of Carol Keep, depending on how low to the ground you are in that deck. So, you know, you're not going to play strictly vampires, but honestly, you only have to have a few vampires in the deck to really get the value out of this, honestly. Because again, one mana for a 2-power creature, that is red. It has no drawback. I mean, this could have a drawback and people would play it. So, absolutely, phenomenally, very super stoked that we have this righteous piece for red aggro now. Next thing I want to talk about, I actually think this is a little more impactful than some people might think right off the rip. This is Sage of Ancient Lore. This is Wedge's spoiler from over at the Mana Source this year, or this set at least. I think he did get a pretty decent one this time. Sage of Ancient Lore is 5 mana, that's 4 generic and then a green for a star, and those stars are equal to the number of cards in your hand. Its power toughness equal to the number of cards in your hand. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, you transform it. It transforms into Werewolf of Ancient Hunger. Its power toughness is equal to the number of cards in all players' hand. Pretty important distinction. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, you transform him back into Sage of Ancient Lore. Card doesn't look incredible at first glance, and even Wedge in the video, he was pretty excited about it, obviously. I would be too. But in the video, he was even like, I'm not sure about constructed playability here, guys, but in the right shell, I think it might actually be a thing. This is obviously a new Morrow. You have to bring that up because that's the most obvious thing about the card. But the fact that it fuels its own power toughness by drawing the card when it enters the battlefield is good. An enter the battlefield ability is always good. I'm a big fan of those, and drawing a card is a particularly good enter the battlefield ability. 5 mana is a lot, but in this case, it's splashable. That's a thing. I think the format may be getting a little bit slower and thus accommodating this card a little bit more. And when it flips, it can probably get pretty big, especially against the right deck. And again, if the format takes an uptick in, how slow it is, if the format slows down, even by just a turn, then this card gets better for that reason. 2 people will have more cards in their hand with the kind of decks we're playing. But this is all speculation at this point. Honestly, I think that 5 mana doesn't completely lock it out of constructed playability. Not necessarily. Just entering the battlefield and drawing a card is good, and then flipping into a fairly large dude is also pretty good. So I'm not entirely sure that this card is bad, and would probably go pretty well in, say, a Bant shell of some kind. I could see that being a good shell for it. The only other thing I have to point out about it is that in a format that features madness, and madness looks to be fairly competitive too, the term all players' hands doesn't mean as much. So you have to take that into consideration. But long story short, I think the card is just interesting enough to warrant keeping an eye on. Next to last thing I want to talk about here, but I actually think it's still very, very impactful. This is Sinister Concoction, and it's one of the better designed cards that I've seen in this set of beautiful designs so far. What you do is it's 1 black mana for an enchantment, and you pay a black mana, you pay 1 life, you put the top card of your library into your graveyard, then you discard a card, and then you sacrifice Sinister Concoction to destroy target creature. Flavor win all day, and mechanic win too, because it fuels so much in this format. It'll fuel Madness, obviously, and it fuels Delirium by 3 cards immediately. And let's not forget, enchantments are tough sometimes to get into your graveyard, so that's awesome. In a Reanimator strategy, this is pretty darn good, allowing you to dump a huge creature from your hand for reanimating later into the graveyard. And it mills a card too, so that's another chance at getting a big creature into the graveyard. So, good for Reanimator, that's good too. The only real gripe that I have about it is that if it's not fueling Madness or it's not fueling Delirium at the time, then what it is doing is 2 for 1-ing you. And that's not very good. But for just 2 black mana spread amongst a couple of different turns, that seems good. If you play this early enough, turn 1, then it's going to be uncounterable removal later on in the game. And that's something to take into consideration against some things. One thing I want to point out, I think the last thing I'm going to say, is that this sort of first thing I thought of was that this is a replacement for Murderous Cut that would have fueled Murderous Cut. Sad to think about. Can you imagine this and Murderous Cut to really delve in the format at the same time? It would be so amazing. Last card I want to talk about today, and I've been talking about how impactful some cards are, but honestly, this card is just a win for me. In, you know, flavor, design, this card, this whole set is really, really well designed. All the design is really fresh, you know, and new. It's not, we were just thinking maybe the design was staling a bit, but all of the stuff in this set is really, really exciting. Never seen a card like this. This is Starter Awake / Persistent Nightmare. It's a transform spell. That's pretty neat. Just look at the design on this thing. Basically, it is a 4 mana that's 2 generic and 2 blue sorcery. Target player, or really target opponent puts the top 13 cards of their library into their graveyard. You mill them 13. Now, if it's in your graveyard, you can pay 3 and 2 blue at sorcery speed to take it from the graveyard and put it onto the battlefield transformed. When it's transformed, it's a 1/1 with Skulk. Reminder there that is an ability where it can't be blocked by creatures that have greater power. And when you do get through unblocked with the card, you return it to its owner's hand. So it's a lot to take in, but basically when you play it the first time, or, you know, well, yeah, when you play it the first time, you mill them 13 and you can pay 5 to take it out of your graveyard, put it into play as a 1/1 with Skulk, and when it does combat damage, it pops back to your hand so you can play it as a spell again. Looks a little janky, and that's what most people are saying is like, I don't know about this. But I actually, as far as like constructive playability, am not totally adverse to this. It's definitely better than Talon of the Telepath, which is something that people were pinning their hopes on for Sphinx's Tutelage decks. And Sphinx's Tutelage decks, I actually think this might be somewhat okay, but it's probably not the thing that deck needs to break the format or anything. Just a really, really well-designed card that does, at the end of the day, take 13 cards off the top of their library. You really don't have to do that more than a couple of times for them to lose the game, especially if you have a tutelage out. So I could see people at least trying to do something with this, and I'll definitely brew something up with it. I'm not sure it'll ever make it to the actual channel, but I'm going to be trying some things because this is one of those cards that I wonder if it truly is janky. An issue is that there are a lot of things in this format that exile creatures, especially in the upcoming format. You know, we just reviewed 2 things that exile creatures so far today. So exile is definitely something that's going to happen a lot. And Declaration of Stone in the format, Complete Disregard, a bunch of stuff. So this card doesn't seem as effective because of that. But, you know, still, end of the day, it's really, really interesting design that if they can't exile it, will maybe end up being an issue, but it also seems really, really slow. So, remaining objective and realistic, it's probably a bad card, but I'm really on its side. That's all the spoilers I have to talk about today. There were a few more, and like I said, I'll give you the link to Mythic Spoiler in the description here if you want to check out some of the stuff you missed. It's mostly intro pack rares and stuff that won't have really hardly any impact, and then a couple of other things that I wasn't too terribly impressed by. But you know, there's some cool stuff. There's an artifact that transforms, or an equipment that transforms and becomes way better when it transforms. So there's a lot of, like I said, fresh design in this set. It's really, really neat. So check all those out, and we'll have more spoilers for you probably tomorrow, or at least the next day after that. I'm working on a bunch of decks, including, like I mentioned earlier, Rakdos Madness, which is now, because of this guy, I would imagine coming along very nicely. So stay tuned, like, share, comment, and if you're new, subscribe. And I'll see you guys later. I'm Dev from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.